Lucius Renard had always hated being controlled. But now, being stuck in a floating city above a dying world, his resentment had festered into something darker, something almost primal. And if there was one thing he had learned during his years of captivity, it was that when you have the power to control nature itself, hating something becomes the least of your problems. "All right, Renard," a cold, almost mechanical voice crackled through his cell's intercom. "Prepare yourself. You're about to conduct the disaster drill again." Lucius ran a hand through his messy brown hair and sighed deeply. There was no point in pretending he was excited. He'd done this so many times that it had become a mindless routine, a sick joke. Being forced to create natural disasters for the Order of Eons had long ceased to feel like a punishment. In fact, it had become his way of showing defiance. The floating city of Etheris, a towering testament to human arrogance, hovered impossibly high above the barren earth. Below, the world had turned into a vast wasteland. Oceans boiled, forests burned, and the land had cracked open like an old, tired piece of parchment. But Etheris, with its steel and glass, remained untouched. For now. "Prepare the wind," Dr. Celine Maris's voice came again, cutting through the silence. "We need a storm. A powerful one. You know what to do." Lucius rolled his eyes. He could almost hear her smirking through the speaker, imagining how pleased she must be that he was obedient. The thought made him want to puke. He stood up from the hard cot in his cramped, featureless cell and stretched. The walls seemed to close in on him a little more each time. They were sterile, unforgiving. The only view outside was a thin window, offering nothing but clouds. The irony wasn't lost on him. They kept him locked away in a city that could defy gravity, and yet it was as empty as his soul. It had been like this for years. They'd taken him when he was just a kid, barely 13, after the incident in his hometown. His powers had awakened in a burst of uncontrollable rage when his parents had been killed in a freak flood. The water had surged from the ground, swallowing whole neighborhoods, sending people to their deaths. Lucius had tried to save them, but the more he struggled, the worse things became. He'd summoned the storm himself. The Order of Eons had found him soon after, rescuing him from the wreckage of his own disaster and bringing him to Etheris. They called it training. To him, it was simply torture. With a grimace, Lucius closed his eyes and began to summon the wind. At first, it was nothing more than a breeze, a teasing whisper of air that fluttered against his face. But he focused, pulling the wind deeper from the corners of his consciousness, pulling the threads of atmosphere into his hands, shaping it, coaxing it. His powers had always been untamed, but over the years, he had learned to bend them to his will, just as they had bent him to theirs. The wind began to howl, fierce and unrelenting. It crashed against the walls, rattling the window. The glass trembled under the pressure, but held. Lucius let out a low laugh. The damn thing had never broken, no matter how many storms he'd created. But today, he wasn't just creating a storm. No, today, this was going to be different. A storm wasn't just wind. Not anymore. He reached deeper, down into the earth itself, and called to the old forces, the powers that slumbered beneath Etheris. Earth. A violent rumble shook the room as he yanked the stones from below, shaking the city's foundations. The sound of cracking metal and groaning structures filled the air. Almost there, Lucius muttered to himself. He opened his eyes, watching the elements coil around him. His heartbeat quickened as he summoned the final force, water. A wave of moisture rolled across the floor, a cold mist swirling up his legs. He could feel the storm gathering strength, the floods creeping through his power, rising with a vengeance. In the distance, the artificial sky above Etheris darkened. The winds howled, the earth trembled beneath his feet, and the air became thick and oppressive. The storm had been born. He was ready. Lucius Renard. Dr. Celine's voice crackled again, her tone sharp. "This is a mandatory drill. Don't make us remind you again." Lucius gritted his teeth. He wasn't in the mood for her usual demands. His hands clenched into fists, and his power surged, pushing past the initial boundaries of his cell, opening a rift. Fire.it exploded around him like a violent surge of rage, fiery tongues licking the edges of his confinement. He knew the drill. He knew it too well. Etherius had designed his every movement, his every moment, to conform to their sick experiments. And every time he performed for them, he broke a little bit more of their control. The fire coiled and spiraled, hot and ferocious. Flames danced like demons, licking the edges of the walls, curling along the ceiling. The heat was unbearable, and Lucius felt it pulse through his veins, a wild, unrelenting beast. His laughter bubbled up sharp, bitter, and full of mockery. If they thought they could control him, they were sorely mistaken. He had learned the city's rhythms, the pulse of its systems. He knew exactly where to strike. More. Dr. Celine's voice ordered. Lucius smiled. More, you say? He raised his hands high, feeling the power coursing through him. All right, document. More it is. He snapped his fingers, and the elements fused. Fire and water, earth and wind, all combined in a cataclysmic blast of destructive energy. The storm began to take form in the sky above Etherius, black clouds swirling, winds raging, the city's very atmosphere vibrating. From the window, Lucius could see the chaos unfold. Lightning flashed, splitting the sky, as the wind tore through the city's districts. The waves of water surged across the floating platform, pushing the edges of Etherius's infrastructure to their limits. Back in the control room, Dr. Celine Maris stood, her eyes cold and calculating as she watched Lucius's storm unfold. The holographic screen in front of her displayed real-time data on the chaos he was causing. The storm was becoming unpredictable, too powerful. He's testing the limits again, Celine muttered, her fingers tightening around the edge of the console. She was angry, but also intrigued. Lucius Renard was an enigma, a dangerous force that the Order had learned to fear but also rely on. She had never fully trusted him. She knew his potential, knew that his power, if unchecked, could unravel everything they had worked so hard to build. And yet, part of her enjoyed watching him perform. There was something mesmerizing about the way he wielded the elements like a true master of nature. Lucius's laughter echoed through the speakers, a reminder that even now, trapped in this floating prison, he still had the upper hand. She knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to escape again. The last time he had tried, he had almost succeeded if not for the monitoring systems that detected his manipulation of the energy core. But this time, she had prepared for it. She tapped a few commands into her console, activating the containment protocols. A series of force fields surged to life around Lucius's cell, trapping him in a magnetic grid designed to neutralize his power. The elements began to falter, wind slowing, fire sputtering, water retreating, earth crumbling to a halt. Lucius felt it immediately. The hold on his powers slipped. He growled in frustration, his mind racing. They were ready for him, but he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Lucius's anger flared as the containment field around him intensified. His powers felt like they were being siphoned away, drawn into the dampening grid like water through a strainer. The wind died, the fire flickered out, and the earth that had trembled beneath his feet stilled. For a moment, there was only silence, then came the unmistakable hum of the force fields locking in place, the metallic whine of his powers being forced into submission. Lucius clenched his fists, feeling the sting of the restriction. But he wasn't done. Not yet. Is that all you've got, Doc? He snarled, his voice echoing in the small, sterile space of his cell. His eyes narrowed, his breath shallow. His power was still there, just hidden beneath the layers of artificial control. He could feel it, coiled and ready to explode. He wasn't the kind to go down without a fight. And though his body was exhausted, beaten down from years of manipulation, his mind had never been sharper. The overhead lights flickered, then dimmed, as the city's security systems took hold of the storm he'd started, feeding on the energy he'd released. But in the midst of the containment grid's hum, Lucius noticed something strange. The air around him felt thinner. It wasn't just the power being drained from him. Something else was off. A deep, resonant vibration began in the floor beneath his feet. At first, it was subtle, almost like an aftershock from the quake he'd summoned earlier. But it grew. The ground trembled in a way that felt unnatural, like something was coming. Lucius's pulse quickened, something was wrong. The force field around him buzzed as if it were struggling to maintain its integrity. Lucius squinted, focusing on the subtle hum coming from below. He had heard this before once, years ago, during one of the Order's earlier experiments. A deep, low rumble that didn't belong to any artificial system. This wasn't just a failure of their containment protocols. This was something else. A sudden realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't just being contained, he was being fed into something. The systems weren't just suppressing his powers, they were using them. Lucius froze, the implications setting in. The Order had been holding him here, testing his abilities for a purpose far more sinister than he had imagined. They had always taken advantage of his control over the elements to simulate disasters. But now, it seemed they had found a way to turn him into a battery, to siphon off his energy and channel it into something much larger. The ground shuddered again, and Lucius felt the tension rise. His eyes snapped open, staring down at the floor, watching the cracks appear, the tiles buckling under an unseen force. And then the hum became a roar. A fissure split the room open like a wound, pouring bright, crackling energy into the room. The force field flickered and began to crackle violently, unable to contain the raw power that surged through it. Lucius's heart skipped a beat. He had no choice now. With a snarl, Lucius pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the sharp ache that shot through his limbs. He had never been one to wait for things to happen. The air around him shivered as he drew on every ounce of energy left inside him. The storm was no longer in his control. The city was, quite literally, falling apart at the seams, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. "Let's see if you like this," Lucius muttered, as he let his powers rip free. First, he summoned the wind. It screamed to life around him, violent and untamed. The force field flickered again, unable to contain the growing gusts. Lucius felt the surge of power rush back into him, wild and chaotic. It was like being freed from a cage, and with it came the rush of everything he had been holding back. He let it build, the wind spiraling around him, twisting with a fury that seemed to shake the very air. Then came fire. Hot, roaring fire, shooting from his palms, wrapping around the walls, licking the ceiling, and devouring the space around him. The heat was unbearable, but Lucius fed the flames, pushing them higher, hotter. The flames were no longer just a tool, no longer a part of the drill. They were a statement. The grid holding him in place crackled and buzzed, but it was too late. He could feel it, the web of control slipping from around him, fraying as the storm inside him gathered strength. The walls began to bend under the force of the wind and the fire licking at the edges of the containment field, burning through metal and stone alike. The air itself seemed to ignite with a raw, primal energy. Then Lucius pushed the earth. The room shook violently as the ground beneath his feet cracked wide open. Stone and concrete crumbled, and the room descended into a chaotic, dust-choked fury. The vibrations were so intense now that the entire structure of Etheris trembled as if it were a leaf in a storm. The facility's internal systems, so carefully designed to maintain order, could no longer withstand the force he was unleashing. The cracks in the walls deepened. One last push, and Lucius felt the air around him thicken. He inhaled sharply, drawing everything in his four elements into one unified storm. Everything seemed to freeze for a moment, then, with a violent crack, the containment grid shattered. The shockwave from the release sent Lucius flying backward, his head slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. But he didn't care. The adrenaline was coursing through his veins now, the feeling of liberation, of freedom. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a force of nature. From outside his cell, the entirety of Etheris began to unravel. The storm Lucius had started in the control room escalated far beyond anything the Order had anticipated. The wind howled, the fire raged, the earth trembled, and water surged in torrents. Etheris was no longer a city suspended above the world. It was a time bomb, ticking down to its destruction. Lucius stumbled to his feet, his chest heaving with exertion. He felt the rush of energy pulsing in his limbs, like an electric current, ready to tear apart anything in its path. His cell was now a ruin, the walls crumbling under the pressure of his unleashed powers. In the distance, he could hear the alarms blaring, the frantic voices of the Order's overseers trying unsuccessfully to regain control. But it was too late. Lucius had broken free, and now the city was his. For a moment, he stood still, allowing himself to bask in the chaos, the utter wildness of it all. He could feel the city crumbling around him, the floating platform groaning as the core trembled beneath the weight of his fury. He smiled, a dark, twisted grin spreading across his face. Aetheris would fall. The Order would fall. And he would rise. Lucius staggered toward the exit, his mind racing. There was no going back now. The sky above Aetheris had darkened, the clouds swirling violently, and the wind screamed with a force of its own. But then, from somewhere deep within the crumbling city, came the unmistakable voice of Dr. Celine Maris. It crackled over the intercom, cold and calculating. "You think you've won?" her voice echoed, laced with venom. "You think you can destroy everything we've built?" Lucius didn't answer. He didn't have to. He had already won. The final piece fell into place as the city's destruction reached its peak. Aetheris, the floating metropolis, was no longer suspended in the sky. It was plummeting, pulled down by the very forces of nature Lucius had once been forced to wield. And as the city began its final descent, Lucius Renard, the elemental prisoner, walked calmly toward the edge. A new world awaited. One where he was no longer a puppet. The last of Aetheris's light flickered, and then it was gone. The wind howled through the crumbling towers of Aetheris as Lucius stood on the precipice of the ruined city, his eyes staring down at the violent storm unfolding beneath him. The city, once a shining example of human ingenuity and arrogance, was now a broken, disintegrating shell, its fate sealed by his own hands. Aetheris was collapsing, but as the city descended, Lucius didn't feel the weight of victory on his shoulders. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, a gnawing hollow deep in his chest. He had done it. He had broken free from their control. He had killed the city. But even as the ground buckled beneath him, and the sky cracked open with violent force, something lingered in the back of his mind. For so long, he had thought freedom meant destruction. That by tearing everything apart, he could finally tear away the chains that had bound him for so many years. But now that it was happening, now that he was the one who had shattered everything, he realized that freedom was a strange thing to carry. There was no grand moment of triumph. No triumphant wave or declaration of independence. Instead, there was only the terrifying awareness that the power he had spent so long fighting against had become part of him. A part that could never be excised, no matter how much destruction he wrought. Lucius stepped forward, his boots crunching against the concrete and metal debris that had once been part of the city's grand infrastructure. He could feel the tremors beneath him as the last remaining supports of Aetheris were eaten away by the chaos of the elements. The ground seemed to vibrate in time with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of the city's impending collapse. His breathing was shallow, but his mind was razor-sharp, moving in 1,000 different directions. The storm overhead was growing stronger by the second, an elemental fury of wind, fire, earth, and water swirling together in a violent tempest that mirrored the storm inside him. There was no going back now. He had sealed the fate of everyone who had ever lived in this floating prison. Aetheris was doomed. And with it, the order of eons. But what was left? What had he really accomplished? He stared out at the horizon, the sea of clouds stretching out before him like an endless void. His hands tingled with the power that had been forced into him for so many years. He could still feel it, the pulse of the elements, now completely under his control, at least for the moment. He could reshape the world if he wanted to. He could level cities, create storms, raise the earth from the ground like a god. But that thought made him uneasy. The storm intensified as if sensing his inner turmoil. The wind screamed, the clouds thickening and swirling faster, the lightning crackling with energy. But Lucius barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, on what came next. What was there after the fall? For years, he had dreamed of escaping Etheris, of bringing the floating city down to Earth. But now that it was happening, the reality didn't feel as satisfying as he had imagined. The collapse of Etheris didn't grant him the clarity he had craved. It only filled him with uncertainty. What would he do now? Who was he, if not the prisoner of the city? If not the elemental weapon, forged in fire and storm? The ground shook again beneath his feet, and this time, Lucius couldn't ignore it. He turned his eyes back toward the horizon and saw that the massive floating platform, the very core of Etheris, was beginning its final descent. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and artificial landscapes, was crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. The foundations beneath it were giving way, but Lucius could feel it, the remnants of the Order's influence still clinging to the air, still lingering in the cracks of the city's decaying infrastructure. They hadn't fully disappeared. They had built something else before the end, a last, desperate measure to retain control. Even as the city collapsed around them, his eyes narrowed. Etheris might be falling, but the Order was not finished. Not yet. He pushed forward, weaving through the crumbling streets, the debris and shattered glass crunching underfoot. His gaze shifted up to the sky, where the swirling storm had reached a fever pitch. Lightning crackled above, turning the world into jagged flashes of blinding white. In the distance, he could see the faint glow of the central core, its energy systems still flickering, still trying to hold the floating city together as it fell. The Order had anticipated this. Lucius could feel it, deep in his bones. The storm had not been an accident. It had been a trigger. A fail-safe they had put in place to ensure that, no matter what, their influence would endure. Lucius's heart sank as he realized the truth. The storm was not a sign of his freedom. It was a reaction, a response. The real goal of the Order wasn't to keep him imprisoned, it was to use him, one last time, as a weapon, and they had succeeded. His mind raced as the thought took root. The Order's core wasn't just the heart of Etheris, it was the center of a much larger scheme. If the storm continued, if he didn't stop it, the consequences would be far greater than the destruction of the city. The world below, the one that Etheris had abandoned, that the Order had forsaken, was not yet beyond saving. Lucius didn't know how much time he had, but he could feel the urgency now. The core was still active. The lightning in the storm was focused, directed toward the heart of Etheris, where the power was being siphoned into something more dangerous than a simple storm. He couldn't let it reach its full potential. The Order had always known that he was the key to unlocking the destructive power hidden in the heart of the planet. They had tested it on him for years, refining their methods until they had finally found a way to make him the fulcrum of a world-altering disaster, but that wasn't going to happen. Not on his watch. He turned toward the center of the city, pushing his exhausted body to move faster. The storm seemed to respond to his determination, its fury rising higher as though sensing his intent. Wind whipped against his face, burning cold and sharp, and the crackling electricity in the air hummed with malevolent force. He knew what he had to do. Lucius had once been a prisoner of Etheris. But now, the city would be his prison. As he neared the heart of the city, he could feel the pressure mounting. The core was alive with energy, the last remaining part of the Order's grand design. His thoughts turned inward, to the elements that flowed through his veins. He needed to pull them all together: fire, water, earth, and wind, and use them to shut down the core before it reached critical mass. The storm had been an accidental release, but this was calculated. This was his last stand. He stepped into the heart of the city, the core's energy pulsing around him like a dark rhythm. The air crackled as he raised his hands, channeling the storm through him, shaping the elements into a singular force. Lightning arced, thunder rumbled, and the wind picked up speed as if answering his call. It was time to end it. Lucius closed his eyes, focused, and let everything go. The storm surged outward in a final, all-consuming explosion of energy. The wind howled, the fire roared, the earth shattered, and the sky itself seemed to split open. In one final act, Lucius Renard became the force of nature that he had always been. The world trembled beneath him, and then, there was nothing.